If you're starting a scientific paper or if you're in the middle of writing a scientific paper, I think you'll find today's video useful because in it I'm going to share a 5-step procedure that I've developed for my own research group and that we've been using for the past year to save us time and stress in writing research papers and really accelerating the progress at which we write and publish. So I'm quite sure that if you follow these 5 steps from start to finish, that you will go from a blank page to submitting a research paper. Now, there's actually a 0th step, which is to download the 5 steps, because these 5 steps are interactive worksheets that you're going to be going through and entering information into. You can download the 5-step worksheet at the GitHub link below, or see the description of the video, which will give you full instructions on how to get the 5 steps. Now let's begin by just talking about what these 5 steps are. The 5 steps are planning, pre-outline, full outline, nearly submittable draft, and final draft. So we're going to start by talking about the planning step. So in the planning step, or step 1, you're really just thinking about what is the purpose of the paper, what is it that I want to contribute, and who are the people that I'm going to be contributing this to, as well as who are the people that I might be writing the paper with. And often with a paper, the hardest part is just getting started. I mean, just like how the coefficient of static friction is larger than the coefficient of rolling friction, just getting started tends to be the hardest part. So step 1 is designed to be relatively quick. So this step should normally take between maybe 1 hour to a few hours. And if it's taking you much longer than a few hours, it's actually a sign that paper writing might be premature for you. So let's just quickly look through the step 1 questions together. So here's the Google Forms format of step 1, and you can see that this is an interactive form that asks you to enter things like what will be the main contributions of your paper. And then it wants you to think about what are the critical contributions, the things that you absolutely need in order to submit the paper? What are things that would be nice to have? And what are things that would be really impactful if you could do it, like stretch goals? In addition to that, the form will have you thinking about things like who will this paper be useful to? What are some related studies for the paper, co-authors? And what you'll find is that by the time you've answered all the questions at the top of this form, you'll have all the information you need to draft a preliminary cover letter for your article. So that's like a big win already, because you've already finished a draft of one portion of your paper in addition to planning your paper steps. So moving to step 2. Step 2 is the pre-outline of the paper. So we're not quite at the part where we write the outline of the paper, but we're going to start to get there. And we're going to mainly think about what our key results are going to look like. And it's okay if you don't have them completed yet, or even if they're very much in a preliminary form in your head of what you'd like to do. You don't have to get it perfect. You just want to clarify what is the type of key result that you want. You also want to think about what is the order in which you present your results. So it doesn't have to be the same order that you did the results. For example, sometimes it makes more sense to show a result first and then show the validation of the procedure later, whereas in reality you probably validated the procedure first and then did the results later. We're also going to be thinking about timelines and also any course corrections that might need to be made later on in the paper. So step 2 normally takes a little bit longer than step 1, but it really shouldn't take you more than about a day or so. And if it's taking you much longer than a day, it's a sign that step 2 is probably premature and you might need to be thinking more about the paper or collecting more results before you fill out step 2. So if we go to scientific paper step 2, again, this is an interactive Google form, and the main thing that you need to do is to actually upload a file that contains your figures and tables that you have for the paper. So here's a submission of what the figures and tables would look like for the paper, so at least draft figures and tables. And so you can see that there's some plots here, and this is what's being proposed by my student in terms of what sorts of papers and figures might go inside this journal article. And you can see that some of these are not very refined. So these are mainly just sketches and ideas that need to be cleaned up if we actually do the paper. In fact, this last figure here is really just a sketch. There's no real data here or anything like that. It's just an idea of what types of results we might have. And then we actually discussed this paper, my student and I, and we came to a conclusion that, well, we have too many heat maps, and so we don't want to show so many heat maps, and this last figure probably isn't needed for the paper. So we refined this into a second version of this, where you can see the refined list of results that we want to show. And this shows more things about like what the procedure is like, how well does the procedure work, and then what are the ultimate data sets generated by the procedure look like, and then some statistical analysis. So by going through and doing this exercise, we were able to refine the direction of the paper without having to write a lot of text or edit a lot of text or really go too far in any direction. So you can go through this form, and again, it'll take you about a day to fill out this form, but once you're done with it, you'll have a very clear direction for your paper, which will make it easy to do the next step, which is the outline of the paper. So here are some tips for step 2. Don't worry about final formatting. Don't worry about final results or final data, and don't worry about the text at all. You don't really need to worry about the references or the citations. Again, we're just trying to set the direction of the paper, and we're trying to move quickly in terms of solidifying that direction. So after completing step 2, we'll move to step 3, which is the full outline of the paper. And this is really where your paper's text is going to start to take shape. So in step 3, you're going to lay out all the sections of your paper to form an outline. And then we're going to plan what we're going to say in every section and the order in which we'll say them. We're not going to have the actual text yet, but we're going to just plan what we're going to say. And we'll create one bullet point for every paragraph that will eventually be in the paper. And the bullet point will provide notes to what we will say in the paper later on. We're going to include the most updated versions of our figures so far, but these don't need to be final versions. And then we're going to think about how to parallelize the rest of the paper writing with the co-authors. So again, step 3 might take a little bit longer than step 2, but usually can be completed in a couple of days. So if it takes you much longer than that, it's a sign that doing step 3 might be premature. All right, so here's again the form for step 3. And if you scroll down, you can see that we want to attach a paper outline. And I'll just show you what this paper outline looks like real quick. All right, so here is a paper outline. And again, we've laid out all the title, the authors, we've laid out all the sections of the paper like abstract, introduction, methods, and then also subsections like content acquisition and paragraph classification, or subsections of the method section. So all of our sections and subsections, and we've inserted all the tables and figures that we have so far. And then we want to write in bullet points what we think we will write about. So in the introduction, what are the main points that we want to make, and just some notes about the citations that we want to make. So again, these are just bullet point notes. They're not actual text yet. In addition to the outline, you want to just talk about what still needs to be finalized. And then a really key thing is to think about your contributors of the paper, because once you have the outline, you can really start parallelizing the writing of the paper. So let's look at an example of how step 3 can help you parallelize your paper. So again, here's an example of a paper that I'm writing, and I have all the sections laid out, and I have a bullet point for each of the paragraph level ideas that I want to include in the paper. And what I would do here is I would actually assign each of these subsections to one person that's a co-author of the paper, and I would give them a clear goal about how many words they should be aiming for, how many references they should be aiming for, and exactly give them very clear instructions. But then they would be in charge of converting these bullet points into text, and they would also be in charge of figures. So this is just a sketch of a figure that's compiled as a collage from previous papers, and they would be in charge of coming up with their own figure that conveys some of the ideas that are listed here. So some tips for completing step 3. Don't worry about writing the real text for now. Don't enter any formatted citations, because that takes a lot of time. And then don't fine-tune any figures, because often we find that figures or data change later in the process. And so if you fine-tune it, you're just going to have to fine-tune it again later on. So once you're done with step 3, you can move to step 4. So step 4 is a nearly submittable draft. And what I mean by a nearly submittable draft is that it's a full paper draft. So it contains everything you would need for a paper, text, figures, references, etc. But it might not meet your internal quality standards. So there's maybe a wish list of things that you'd like to do to the paper still, and that wish list could be relatively long, but this still counts as a fully complete paper. So the goal is to turn your outline into a paper that's kind of good enough so that you actually have the full thing completed, and then all the stress goes away because you have a completed paper. And then you can go back later and then polish all the things that you want to polish in order to make the things really, really shine in step 5. And doing this step is probably the longest step of the entire 5-step checklist. It can usually be completed in about a week. If it takes much longer than that, it's a sign that step 4 might be premature. So the form for step 4 looks like this, and these forms tend to become fewer and fewer questions and more just attaching something. And in this case, you're going to attach your nearly submittable paper. So again, this is the paper that isn't quite up to your quality standards, and you might have a wish list of things to do, but it could be potentially submitted very soon if needed. And it'll still ask you a couple of questions like what's your wish list of changes that you might still want to make to this paper, and then how might collaborators assist. And so for example, if you have a wish list of 12 items that you'd still like to do to improve this nearly submittable draft, you might be able to assign 2 or 3 of those wish list items to some of your collaborators. So after that, you're basically done with step 4, and then you can move on to step 5. Before that though, here's a few tips for step 4. So the first step is to remember to consider parallelizing the step amongst the co-authors. If you can split up the work of converting bullet points to text, that really helps. Remember to aim for submittable or good enough and to save the polishing for later. Sometimes it's really tempting to just keep working on the same paragraph over and over again and try to get it perfect. But it's much better to just move on to the next paragraph once a paragraph is in submittable shape and then polish it when you have time later. And then finally, if you're struggling to get through this step, try going in the following order. Try turning the method bullet points into text first, then the results, then the intro, then the discussion, then the conclusion, and then the abstract. That'll just get your momentum going because you'll start with the easiest parts and then go to the hardest parts. If you start with the intro, that's going to be one of the harder parts to convert and you might get stuck. And remember finally that as long as you keep going, as long as you convert bullet points to text, you will finish. So as long as you keep doing this, like you will have a nearly submittable draft at the end, and then all the stress of the paper will go away once you have this nearly submittable draft. So for step 4, let's also go through an example of what a nearly submittable draft looks like. A nearly submittable draft basically just looks like a paper, and there might be some notes for yourself. Like for example, here I didn't have time to align this figure properly, and I have a little purple note for myself that says to make the figure align better into a grid. And there's maybe little notes here and there about other references or citations that I want to add that I don't necessarily have time to look up at this moment, and I just want to get through the paper first and then go through and add some of these citations later. All right, so we're now at the final step, which is the final draft of your paper. Now in step 5, you're basically just going to go through your wish list of all the things that you wanted to do in your nearly submittable draft but didn't have time to do because you were just trying to finish the thing instead of trying to make it perfect. So in step 5, you'll clean up your text to your quality standard, you'll check your citations for completeness, and then just go through a checklist to double check things for correctness. And step 5 actually usually takes less time than step 4, so ideally I would say this should take you less than a week. If it's taking you more than a week, it's probably a sign that you're over polishing the paper or spending too much time in the paper. Okay, so step 5 is the final draft of your paper. The main thing that you need to do is to upload the final draft of your paper, so that's at the bottom here, and that's straightforward. But I've also included a checklist of a lot of the checks that I tend to do for final drafts of papers because they're the common mistakes that sometimes slip through the final draft. For example, one thing that I like to do is to just check the numbers independent of the text. I find that a lot of times results are updated in one figure but not updated in the corresponding table or vice versa, so the numbers are incorrect or columns got switched in a table or something like that. And if you just spend a round checking the numbers in the draft and forgetting about the text, you can often spot a lot of errors. There's also a couple of other things in this checklist to just go through and make sure that you have the best chance of having a successful paper submission. Okay, so let's talk about some tips for step 5, the final draft of the paper. The biggest tip is really don't get stuck. It's important to know when to stop polishing or when to know when things on your wish list maybe should be saved for another paper or for another research project. Because at some point it's much better if you just get this paper out and let other people read it and understand it and benefit from all the things that you've contributed, and then you move on to the next thing and to the next big result, versus you spending all your time holding onto this paper and polishing it over and over again. Okay, so we've done it. We've gone from blank page to submission in 5 steps. If you didn't already download the worksheets that I mentioned, I've shared another link to them below. And since you've made it to the end, here's just a couple of bonus tips. The first one is, regardless of whether you're a student or whether you're an advisor, just set a deadline for every step. It will keep things moving and just keeps a sense of progress going on the paper. If you're a student, each time you complete one of these steps, you can send the completed worksheet to your advisor and then you can go over it together. And this will just give you a rhythm, momentum, and direction of progress, as well as short-term deadlines that you can use to just keep yourself on track. And if you're an advisor, you can send the blank forms to your students and have them complete them at a regular schedule. And this will just keep the both of you making regular progress on your paper. Or you can just send them this video and then have them do it from their end. So I hope the next thing that you do regardless is to just get started and to go through the forms and to start with step 1 and get all the way to step 5 so that you have a successful paper writing process. And I will see you in the next video.